I've been collecting items that would typically get thrown in the recycling bin or in the trash to repurpose them into beautiful home decor vases. Last week, I melted down a few Dollar Tree candles and saved the jars to create some cute little bud vases. First, I need to clean out the remaining wax residue, and I used my heat gun to do that. This remelted the wax and allowed it to drip down to the bottom, and then I just wiped it out with a paper towel. So for this first one, I grabbed my polymer clay and rolled it out, not paying much attention to the shape of it. I just want to make sure that it's thick enough to hold its shape. Then I cut it down into a thin strip and applied it to the side of the glass jar. I've been seeing a few pottery designs like this on my Pinterest feed lately and wanted to give it a shot. The clay sticks pretty well to the glass on its own. I do go back and add some glue here in a little bit, but I wanted to get all the pieces on first. I pinched the outer edge of the clay all the way down to start creating that ripple look. Once I got all the pieces on, I'm taking this Sculpey oven bake adhesive and added it all along the edge of each clay strip. Not too much, just enough to make sure it stays on the glass. And I kind of wiggled the clay a little bit to make sure the glue got underneath of it. Then I put the jar into the oven at 275 degrees Fahrenheit for about 30 minutes. Then you want to turn the oven off and let it gradually cool down inside. The next day, once the glass was cooled off, I painted everything in this sandy blonde color by DIY Paint and gave it 3 coats. When painting glass, you want to let each coat fully dry before adding that next coat. Otherwise, you'll lift up some of that previous paint layer. Now, I was debating if I wanted to leave it this solid color or add some white wax to it, and I landed on adding the white wax. I always scoop out a little bit of the wax onto a popsicle stick, that way my brush doesn't contaminate it or get any of that colored paint into the wax. I added the white wax to a few sections and then wiped it off with a dry paper towel. Let me know in the comments, which version did you prefer, the solid tan or with the white wax? I really like how it looks with the wax. This next candle jar upcycle is super easy. First, I gave this jar a coat of white gesso for a base. I'm going to decoupage this one, and if you want the color of the napkin to stay vibrant, paint the surface white. I gave the jar 2 coats and then sanded it lightly to remove any brush strokes. Now, to add the napkin, I'm using my DIY liquid patina. I really love this decoupage medium for napkins. It dries quickly and somehow leaves less wrinkles. Like I said, the liquid patina dries pretty quickly, so you do want to work in small sections. There are a few ways you can apply napkins for decoupage. I prefer to use my fingers to smooth it out. That way I can feel for any wrinkles. When I got around to the beginning, I made sure not to overlap the glue onto the napkin that was already laid down. Since napkins are so thin, you would be able to see that seam and anywhere that the napkins overlapped. But after the napkin was on, I set it aside to dry. Once it was completely dry, I cut the excess napkin off and then gently sanded. You want to sand in a downward motion so you don't lift up that napkin. I was actually really surprised that I was able to sand the seam where the napkin edges meet. I thought for sure it would just rip the napkin I had already laid down right off. For a little detail, I grabbed some cotton twine and beads. I strung them up smallest to largest in the middle and then back to smallest. I did this 2 times so there were beads on each end of the twine, and then I wrapped it around the top a few times. That's it for this one. Like I said, super easy. For the third candle jar, and before we move on to another type of container, I'm taking some bamboo skewers and going to glue them all the way around. I had wanted to use dowels for this so it was a little bit thicker, but I didn't have enough on hand, so bamboo skewers it is. Now, don't judge the way I added this first section. I came up with a much better way to do it. You want to add a rubber band to both the top and bottom of the jar. Then I added a section of glue onto the glass and put a handful of skewers down between the rubber bands. I think this was the easiest way to get them all added. I let the glue dry and then took a pencil to outline where I want to cut the skewers down. I wanted the top to have a wave to it, so I drew that on and then took some nippers to cut the skewers down along that line. As I started cutting, there were some loose skewers that the glue didn't quite cover, so I went back in with my hot glue to make sure they stayed in place. Then I sanded the top edges of the skewers because they were pretty jagged. Next, I wanted to mirror that wave design and drew it on the bottom section as well. And then I painted the bottom portion white. Another super easy upcycle, and all 3 will be listed for sale on my site. For this next project, I'm using an old banana pepper ring jar. First, I need to remove that label. Usually my heat gun will work just fine to release the glue and peel the label right off, but it didn't work so well on this one. I was able to use my Cricut spatula and got most of it off. I have tried tinting glass a few times on my channel, and I wouldn't call any of these attempts super successful, so I wanted to give it another try using a slightly different method. I recently picked up these silicone mixing cups with silicone popsicle sticks to use on projects like this, and I'll link them in my description box. But the last 2 times I tried tinting glass, I used Mod Podge with food coloring. And while it kind of works, this time I decided to use clear Elmer's glue. I poured some glue into the silicone cups and then added some food coloring. I wanted to create an amber glass type of look, so I added 1 drop of red and then maybe 4 to 5 drops of brown. It was way too red at first, so I kept adding brown until I was happy with it. Then I poured it into the jar. You're going to see I'm using a different bottle here. This one is actually plastic, and I realized later I wouldn't be able to add that into the oven to set it. I did try to let it air dry, but it really didn't hold the color at all. I'll show you that here in a little bit, but you want to pour the glue into the container and slowly let it coat the inside. Most tutorials I have seen add water to the glue as well. I did not do that. I wanted the mix to be on the thicker side. Once the jar was coated, I stuck it in the oven for 30 minutes at 275 degrees Fahrenheit. And you guys, this is my best attempt to tint glass yet. The Elmer's glue worked so much better than Mod Podge. Not only did it tint the glass, there are no bubbles like I see when using Mod Podge, and the glue feels like it is part of the glass, not just a rubbery layer on top. You can see some bubbling at the very bottom. That's where the excess glue built up a little bit, but from the outside, you really don't see that at all. My only complaint is the color is not as deep as I wanted it, and was still a little bit too red. So I did the process again and only used brown food coloring this time. I am so excited that I finally figured out how to tint glass. Now, to embellish it a little bit, I grabbed this Dollar Tree ribbon to layer in the middle. I was trying to figure out a way to cover up that rim so it didn't look so much like a jar, but I couldn't figure out what to add and keep this same aesthetic. I tried twine, but that didn't work for my style, so that's it for this one. Here's how the plastic bottle one turned out. It is super sheer, and I even added several layers of the dyed glue to try and build up that color. Alright, this next one is a little bit more involved. I had this empty protein container that I'm turning into, you guessed it, another vase. I wanted to add some sort of pipe design to the outside of the container. Again, this is something I've been seeing on my Pinterest feed and wanted to give it a shot. I found these piping bags and piping tips at the Dollar Tree, and this is the perfect project to test them out. So I grabbed my spackle, and you can tell by its barely pink color that it's pretty dried out. So I added some water to try and revive it. This didn't work out that well, but I kept going and put the spackle into a piping bag. I used the petal tip, which is this half moon looking one, and just went for it. That was problem number 2. I didn't have a plan as to what design I was creating. I thought I was going to do a little staggered teardrop shape all the way around the top portion, but since the spackle was half dried out, it kept clumping up and clogging the tip. The whole thing started to look really sloppy. So I wiped off all that spackle with a spatula and set it aside while I came up with a plan. I wanted this vase to look more homemade and like pottery, and the rim was not helping to achieve that look. So I got out my hot knife and melted that top rim off. Then I used the flat surface of the knife to melt down any of those rough edges. Then I took what was left of my half dried out spackle and smeared it all over the container. I used my hand to do this, which probably wasn't the smartest option, but since it was drying out, I figured this was probably the easiest. Then I set it aside to dry. Once it was dry, I came in with sandpaper to smooth out any of those super rough areas. At this point, I was really doubting if this project was going to turn out decent at all. There was just way too many ridges on this. It wasn't going to work to add a design on top. So I bought some joint compound, which I prefer over spackle on a project like this anyways, and I spread it over the whole surface again. This time I used a trowel to try and get a smoother result. Again, once it dried, I sanded it down, and for some reason as the joint compound was drying, it formed a bunch of little air bubble pockets, and you can see a bunch of tiny little pinholes all along the surface. So I added one last layer of joint compound to fill in those holes. Finally, it is looking how I wanted. Not perfectly smooth, but not too much texture. Okay, now it's time to draw on the design. I decided to go with a leaf vine type of look. I thought that might be a little bit easier for my first attempt at doing something like this. One thing I will note though, you want to make sure the pencil marks are light so they can easily be covered up. I pushed a little too hard on my pencil lines and they were pretty dark. This time when I add the design, I wanted it to be a color. So I grabbed my Dixie Belle mud and I put some green paint in it. I did add some food coloring as well, but that was too bright of a green. Now, this didn't turn out perfect, but by the end I was getting the technique down, and I definitely want to try this again. To get that petal leaf shape, you want to squeeze the bag and allow the mud to come out until it's the size you want. Then you drag the bag and the tip down and kind of scrape it to get the rest of the leaf shape. I hope that makes sense. The first side is easy to do. It's the second side that gets tricky when you're trying not to mess up what you already did. For this trash to treasure project, I'm using an empty hot sauce bottle. I really love the curved shape at the top. I removed the label, and for this one you don't need to worry about getting all of that residue off. I'm turning this one into a paper mache bottle using my Celluclay. This is an instant paper mache, and all you need to do is add water until you have a dough-like consistency. Then I just added the mixture onto the bottle. I used a silicone spatula to do this, but you could also just use your hands. You can make it as thick as you want or even alter the shape of the jar just by building the paper mache up in different areas. When I got to the top, I used my fingers more so that I could make sure I didn't lose the shape, and then set it aside to dry overnight. Once the paper mache was dry, I'm painting it in the color Prairie Gray with a sponge dauber. At first I was just gliding the sponge over the surface, not worrying about full coverage on every inch, but then I decided I wanted a little bit more coverage of this color. Still not full coverage though. And last, I took my white wax and added that all over the jar as well. I like how this ended up looking super dimensional and aged. I hope you enjoyed these trash to treasure vases. I still have plenty more trash to treasure ideas on ways you can upcycle items like this, so keep an eye out for another video in the future.